All right, I'm going to try something a little bit different today for this chapter. We're going to go into chapter 3. And what I've done in the past is I've combined China and India together, but I think that's confusing. So I'm going to separate them into just talk about India and all the India stuff, and then in the next chapter just talk all about China instead of doing India and China and then India and China again. We'll see how it works out. So to begin, as we always begin all of these new civilizations, we're going to talk about the geography of India, and I'm going to flash a map up there in a second and show you what that looks like. And you should have your maps already done and in front of you as we do this, but the map of India, it's a subcontinent, meaning it drops below the rest of the continent of Asia. It's considered part of Asia, but it does drop below and form like a peninsula, a sub meaning below continent, below the continent. It's also to the north, has all of its mountains, and this should be reviewed. We should have talked about this already in class if you're watching this after we did it in class. You have the Hindu Kush Mountains and the Himalaya Mountains to the north and to the east and west. And then the main area that we're going to talk about is the river valleys, of course, like we did with the Egyptian Nile and Mesopotamia with the Euphrates River and the Tigris River. And this one has rivers as well where they settled. And the main river that we're going to be talking about is the Indus River and the Indus River Valley. And the Indus River Valley gave rise to several different civilizations, several different cities that we're going to be talking about that are very important. Those mountains to the north kind of limited contact, so they didn't run into a lot of enemies. And we saw how there wasn't really any natural boundaries in Mesopotamia, so they were constantly fighting wars, like warfare, the Hittites and the Hyksos and the Assyrians and all these other groups, and the Persians and the Babylonians and the Akkadians. They're always all fighting. All right, that didn't happen here in the Indus Valley because they had these mountains that protected them, and so they were a very peaceful culture. There are almost no weapons found. When they do all the archaeologists go in and they look around, there's almost no weapons. So they were a very peaceful culture. What else do you need to know about the geography? On the eastern and western portion of southern India, you have mountains, the eastern and western Ghats, and they form big plateau. So it starts off low, and then you form what's called the Deccan Plateau, which is like a mountain with a flat top. Also, the Ganges River is also very important because it's considered sacred to many of the people that live in India. And the word sacred is like holy, has very religious properties. It's tied to their religion in certain ways. There's also a desert, the Thar Desert in central India. So it's got a lot of different natural geographic features. One of the big geographic features, and it's not like a land or whatever, but it's called monsoons. Monsoon is a key word, and that means seasonal wind. And these seasonal winds were like a defining part of the people living in the Indian subcontinent's life. Why? Because it led to being able to grow crops at a certain time of the year and not being able to grow crops during a certain time of the year. So you have these winds, these seasonal winds, and like the winter winds that came in October came from like China and the Himalayas and the desert that was Taklamakan Desert, and they came blowing across into India from north to south, from east to west. And they brought really hot, dry air, and it withered out the crops and dried everything up. Then in the winter, you have from the south and west blowing up from like Africa and the Indian Ocean, and that's bringing moist air and water, and it's dumping tons of water onto their land. And that's kind of like when they can grow their crops. So you know what happens if they get too much water, it's going to flood. Right? So that's going to be a problem, is too much water flooding, not enough water. Obviously, we know that leads to droughts and not enough food. So they had to keep that in balance. However, the area that we're going to talk about first, all right, in the Indus River Valley, key Indus River Valley, The two cities, they were called like sister cities because they were so much alike, were Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. Both these cities were on the Indus River. And they were planned cities, meaning they were built ahead of time, and then the people lived there. So they laid down all these grid work pattern of streets. This is very important. They had their streets evenly lined out and in grid patterns, and they put different things in certain sections. So all of your commerce would be in one section, your living facilities would be in another, your religious buildings and government buildings would be in another, and they kind of planned all this out and then built it. They also had, as I said, bricks that they made. They baked these bricks in ovens, and they had indoor plumbing, which was unheard of anyplace else in the world at this time. So they could take baths and have the plumbing flow out of their cities. Drinking water and stuff like that. They also had a system of weights and measures. You could tell that they had a government because all this stuff had to be planned out and controlled and monitored and regulated. So they had a government. Archaeologists believe they had a very strong government. They traded. We found these little, well, I didn't, but archaeologists have found these stamps all over India and then all over in different parts of the world too, in like Arabia where they had traded. They have little things on like cattle and different tigers and all sorts of different symbols. So they know they had a writing system. We can't read the writing system. We can't decipher. There's no Rosetta Stone for the Indus people like there was for the ancient Egyptians. So we just their language remains a mystery to this day. But they are fascinating people. We're going to watch a John Green video that shows really how fascinating they were. They're the first people to cultivate cotton, and of course we use cotton for stuff like this, our clothing. They covered the largest area of any civilization at the time. Most of the people were farmers. They used to be nomads, but then they became farmers. What else do you know? Oh, they're polytheistic. Religious beliefs are very important in their culture too. They're a polytheistic religion. And they believe that there were many gods. You have gods like, Mother Goddess. They venerated animals, and like the cow. You've probably heard of that. Some people like venerate cows even to this day in India. We don't exactly know what happened to these early people though. They died out. Could it have been they used trees to burn in their ovens to bake their bricks? Could it be that they chopped down too many trees and caused an ecological disaster? Could have been an earthquake and it just like changed the direction of the river, or just crushed their cities? A volcanic eruption. Remember all these mountains there? They could have had a volcano. Maybe invaders came in. We just don't know. It's a mystery to us still to this day of what caused these early Indus people to decline. All right, moving on. Around 1500 BC or so, you have a group of people called the Aryans who invade in the Indus River Valley. Now, how did they get in there? Well, we're not 100% positive, but we think that they came in through the Khyber or Bolan Pass. And if you remember the map that we did, I showed you those little passes, and they think that they came through the mountains through these passes and invaded and conquered the people that were living there. Remember, it wasn't those ancient Indus people. They had already died out, but the new people. Who are the Aryans? Well, they were nomadic warriors. Sometimes they're referred to as Indo-European people, and they were also polytheistic. They felt like they were superior because they had better weapons and better skills. They also had lighter skin, and so they kind of separated the lighter skinned Aryans from the darker skinned Indian people that were living there. And they didn't really build a lot of cities. They had been nomadic, and so but then they settled down. They settled down and became farmers once they were there. They had this idea of what's called a caste system. We're going to talk a lot about the caste system in the coming weeks, and they basically believed that there was groups of people, and top to bottom, and originally it was based on your skin color. So the lighter skinned people were at the top of the caste system, and the darker skinned people were at the bottom. So the lighter skin would have like the government jobs, they would be like the priests, they would be the warriors and the leaders and the government officials, and the people at the bottom would be like the merchants and the farmers and the slaves and that kind of stuff. Eventually, because they all intermingled with each other and had children with different groups, even though it was like frowned upon, over time, eventually, instead of being based on skin color, it was based on occupation. So at the top of their society were the Brahmins, who were the priests, and then below them would have been the princes and the warriors class, and then below them, of course, your merchants and traders, and then we're farmers. And then another group is eventually going to develop called the Untouchables, and when we get to talk about Hinduism, I'll talk about that a little bit more. Early on, they did not have a written language, but eventually they do develop one called Sanskrit. And from that, we start to get a lot of understanding of what these people did. In fact, two of the great poems and works of literature came from this time period, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Okay, that's a mouthful. Mahabharata and Ramayana. And they were epic poems, like the Epic of Gilgamesh that we had talked about. You have the Epic of Mahabharata and the Epic of Ramayana. And they basically celebrate a lot of warriors and fighting and wars and battles, cousins fighting against cousins, and talks about like Krishna, who's one of the main characters, talks about fighting and being a warrior and what it means to be in these different castes. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about the caste system later on. And the Ramayana is pretty similar. It portrays what it is to be a hero and also what it means to be an ideal woman. And an ideal woman is said to be obedient and loyal to her husband, sometimes to a fault. All right, so I am actually going to wrap it up for section 1. That's plenty of information there. Just to kind of like as a review, as a summary, remember subcontinent drops below the continent, monsoons, seasonal winds that bring warm air and dry air, and the cold air. And well, it was wet. I don't know how cold it was, but it was definitely wet, moisture, and that's when it all dumped on them. So remember monsoons, the seasonal winds. Remember the Indus people, the grid cities, the indoor plumbing, the planned cities, the Ganges River, the Indus River, the Ganges being sacred, the veneration of cows. Remember the Aryans coming in and kind of taking everything over and developing the caste system and the writing system. And that's really it. All right, so that was the part 1 of India. We'll do part 2. We'll talk about like the caste system and what life was like in India in the later years with the empires and things like that.